Tangled webs, people. Tangled webs. If it wasn't for the smattering of other topics on this channel, I should just call it the Tangled Webs channel. Someone's bound to have that one already. Anywho, part 2 of our Ladies Who Murder. As mentioned last week, there are some coincidences, similarities between Olivia and this week's gal, but definitely not with regards to motive. We'll get to that in a bit after I introduce you. The murder. Saturday, December 10th, 1921. While seeing patients at his doctor's office/home at 535 Bedford Avenue, I'm picturing something like out of the Cosby Show, Dr. Abraham Glickstein welcomed a female patient into the examination room. He said nothing to her that seemed fearful or worrisome to anyone else in the waiting room. In fact, the exchange appeared friendly. Her hands were hidden in a muff, and the door was closed. Once inside, she lifted her hands and attempted to shoot Dr. Glickstein with the hidden revolver. Nothing happened. She pulled the trigger again, and he was shot through the heart. If you want to continue the song in your head, you can. The woman left quickly and headed out of the waiting room and out of the building. No one in the waiting room had actually heard the shot. According to one newspaper, Dr. Glickstein had actually opened the door to the office, shouted, "My God, get me help!" And at that, he collapsed. His wife was downstairs and heard a shriek and hurried upstairs. One of the patients ran across the street and found a patrolman and asked him to call for an ambulance. No one knew he had been shot until the ambulance arrived with a doctor. I think one of the waiting patients thought he had a hemorrhage. Obviously, there's blood, but didn't look for the source of it, I guess. Dr. Glickstein was dead. But who had done it? And why? Dr. Glickstein's mother, on viewing his body when it was taken into the home/office for the funeral, fell dead after she allegedly said, quote, "Abel, my son, it ought to be you going to my funeral. Instead, I am going to yours. I wish to God I was dead instead of you. My boy, I must go with you." End quote. Apparently, news of his death had been withheld from her until this moment, when she had initially been told he had only had an operation. Then she goes to his home and sees funeral preparations and his body in the casket. And she literally died right then and there. At the funeral, detectives were looking for any suspicious attendees. With the detectives were 2 female patients who had been in the waiting room at the time Dr. Glickstein's murderer was there, hoping that one of them would recognize one of the women at the funeral. But nothing came of it. Detectives took the physician's correspondence and lists of patients for perusal to see if anyone had some sort of known beef with him. And after also speaking with the doctor's widow, the detectives had some leads. The murder weapon and the muff it was hidden in were found across the street from the scene of the crime. It would be a few days after the murder when Mrs. Lillian Raizen would confess to District Attorney Lewis that she shot and killed Dr. Glickstein at his home/office, and she would turn herself in. So who are the players in this real-life drama? Dr. Abraham Glickstein. Dr. Abraham Glickstein was 48 years old and had been practicing in Brooklyn for 20 years. He had graduated from the College of the City of New York and from Bellevue Medical School. After getting his doctoring degree, he worked at Beth Israel Hospital in Manhattan, and before moving to his Bedford Avenue location. Prior to that, he had been at South 5th Street and Marcy Avenue, also in Brooklyn. He was married and had 2 daughters, both of whom were grown up and out of the house and married. Lillian Schaefer Raizen. Lillian Raizen was born in Austria and had been a bookkeeper for years. She's said to speak quickly and well with intelligence, but of a smaller stature at 5'2". She was 29, had been married to her childhood sweetheart, Charles Raizen, for 6 months. He is a Brooklyn toy manufacturer and also dabbles in real estate a bit. Backstory. Dr. Glickstein had been the family doctor since Lillian was a kid, and the 2 families would become friends over the years. 8 years earlier, let's say around 1913, Dr. Glickstein and Lillian would have relations. She thought he loved her. She would sometimes try to put him out of her life, but it would never last long. Then she became engaged to Mr. Charles Raizen, 29, who was her childhood sweetheart. He had courted her off and on for over 8 years before she finally accepted him and consented to marriage. She thought then she could let go of her past and find happiness. On the night before her wedding to Charles, or 3 weeks earlier, this is hazy in the papers, again only 6 months before the murder, Dr. Glickstein called her up, asking for a chat in his office. She went, thinking that this would finally be his apology for what he had done to her. According to Lillian, when she got to his office, he, quote, tried to forcibly detain her, end quote. It was on her honeymoon to Charles that she confessed all to her new husband. She was readily forgiven, and they set up residence with her parents in New York, temporarily. Things were great for a few months. Well, not great perhaps, though Charles had given her every assurance that she was forgiven and that he didn't care about her past. He would say, quote, she was like a lost person, end quote. Then Lillian became ill, and she was advised by her physician to head to the south for some R&R. She went to Florida for a time while her husband stayed in Brooklyn to continue running his business. The change in scenery did not clear her head, though. Dr. Glickstein was taking up permanent residence in her brain case. She feared that what had been between them would be found out publicly, and the only way to guarantee that it would never come out and that he could never hurt her again was to get rid of Dr. Glickstein. Quote, I became obsessed with the idea that I must destroy the man who destroyed me. I got a man in Jacksonville to buy a pistol for me, thinking that if I looked at it long enough, I could make myself brave enough to kill him, end quote. She took a boat from Florida back to New York, which you would think the time spent would have perhaps been to talk herself out of it. No, she didn't tell her husband or her family she was returning to her home state. She stayed at a hotel in Manhattan under her own name, and the next day headed for Dr. Glickstein's residence, which again was where he also did his doctoring. And you know the rest. Bewildered for a few minutes after she killed him, she then took a streetcar back to Manhattan and stayed with a friend. The timeline of events is a little cloudy for her, but either the next morning or the morning after, she called her father and told him what had happened. He immediately contacted her husband and attorneys, and that's when it was decided for her to surrender. Her neurologist, Dr. Samuel Tannenbaum, the one who had recommended a trip down south for her nerves, knew of her obsession to kill, that on her return to New York she had told him she had purchased a gun. He believed her mind had been a bit off-kilter for months. He had become her confidant and was concerned that her complex regarding Dr. Glickstein and her life-sapping inhibition would come to violence, either against her own self or against Dr. Glickstein. Dr. Glickstein's widow, quote, I suppose that you men are glad this woman has been found, but I have been growing weaker every moment since I was told of her confession. I don't want to hang her. She is a mother's child, and I don't want to hurt any mother's child. But I would like to see a dark cloud over her head, though I have no vengeance in my heart. Why did you take my husband's life? Lily, why did you do it? You appeared to me as a Lily, but I was mistaken, end quote. After her plea, she would continue. Quote, do you want me to tell you something? I first met her at 177 Madison Street, Manhattan, 18 years ago. The family was made up of 5 girls and a boy, and they had a nice mother and father. I don't know how many years I lived there with them, but I actually brought them up in my arms. I always told them to believe in God. The doctor treated all the children for their sicknesses, and she was the last one in the world I thought would kill him. She's the type of woman who is sensible. She always acted like a man. She had a mouth which could do more talking than 20 men. She was a businesswoman and made much money herself, end quote. Lillian was indicted by a grand jury for murder in the first degree. She pled not guilty, apparently in an increased state of nervousness, even collapsing at one point, which delayed her arraignment, but she finally was calm, and the indictment was read. She would be escorted to the Raymond Street jail to await trial, and it's assumed she will probably plead insanity. Already there's evidence floating around out there. She had written to a Jacksonville store the month before asking for the cost of a revolver. The letter read, quote, I am turning through the South alone and would like to carry some protection with me. Will ask you to please advise me of the price of a .32 caliber revolver with noiseless attachment, end quote. A week or so later, the store clerk would say that he had sold a revolver to a woman of dark complexion. A man apparently was with her when the purchase was made, which is interesting, given his name as T.G. Ellis. I never could find out who this person was. Lillian had been asked by reporters if she had any regrets, and if she could do it all over again, would she have shot him? Quote, "No. If I had control of myself, I would not. I am sorry for what I have done." End quote. Apparently, Dr. Glickstein had appealed to her through flattery, telling her she could make a wonderful doctor, that she had a superior brain, she shouldn't get married because then she wouldn't be able to have the career, tied down with children and all. He also told her that his own wife was crazy and that he was contemplating having her put in an asylum. As happens, more information is coming out as the days pass, and perhaps more of a motive for what had happened. Again, Dr. Glickstein is dead. We don't have his side of things. Lillian said that during the 6 years or so that they were intimate, he had performed an operation that made her unable to have children. Once she got married to Charles and realized that she wouldn't be able to have children with him, I guess that realization is what burned inside and made her want revenge. She would say later, quote, "I had long felt that it was the terrible bondage in which he held me that was destroying me, but it completely enmeshed me. I fought against it desperately but blindly. Night and day I felt the weight of his thought upon me. Its unfathomableness maddened me. In spite of his physical attractiveness, he had a powerful magnetism over my mind." 2 years before my marriage to Charlie Raizen, I managed to free myself of the doctor. Someone told me of Christian Science. I flew to it. Once I caught the strength of truth and learned to see myself as perfect, my heart gave a great bound. It was indescribably overburdened happiness, dazzling wonderfully. Then I planned to marry Charlie, the only man I ever loved. In the midst of this happiness, Dr. Glickstein, whose family received an invitation to my wedding, called me on the telephone and said I must see him. End quote. This is when she goes on to describe her going to his office to see him and him grabbing her, etc. Quote, "After that, I felt my mind slipping." End quote. It sounds like the trauma of his attempt on her, of whatever he was attempting, brought her back down mentally, and she could not recover from it. The newspaper interestingly pointed out, quote, "Her trial would be notable for the introduction of ideas and phrases unfamiliar to legal terminology, her alleged vengeance complex, her murder obsession, words borrowed from the lexicon of the psychoanalyst." End quote. That's from the Pensacola Journal, December 16th, 1921. Nowadays, mental health terms are practically standard and expected in court cases, but back then, it was not the norm. Charles, again her husband, would agree with Dr. Tannenbaum's assessment of her psychological complexity to a degree. Quote, "She never talked of taking the life of Dr. Glickstein, but she talked of suicide. I tried to dissuade her. It was at Atlantic City that she told me of her relations with the doctor, and I forgave her and tried to comfort her, told her that we would live it out together." End quote. Charles believed, though, that when she had gone to Dr. Glickstein's office, that she had gone to take her own life in front of the doctor. Due to her mindset, she was being closely watched in her jail cell. Similarities between Olivia and Lillian. Now, I know I promised you some information about our two femme fatales, last week's story about Olivia Stone and today's Lillian Raizen. You may have already noticed some similarities. Both did their murdering in Brooklyn. I'm sorry, Brooklyn. Both murdered men because of some sort of betrayal. Both pled insanity. Both ended up at the Raymond Street jail. Not in the same cell, but according to one paper, there were a couple of vacant cells between them. Olivia, who was a nurse you may remember, is actually trying to help Lillian, volunteering to help care for her, saying that she wanted to help, quote, "a sister in distress," end quote. Olivia's murder was in August 1921, Lillian's in December. What gets pointed out later, though, is that Olivia's case was of a woman who loved too much. Not wisely, but too well. Lillian wasn't in love with Dr. Glickstein at all. Back to Lillian. A man had met her on the pier in New York when she returned from Florida. He was a 60-year-old waiter named Albert Bradley. She knew him back in the days when she worked in a shirt factory, and she would eat her meals at a restaurant that he worked at. They became friends. She had written to him while she was in Florida, I guess needing a friend to read about her woes, and she had asked him to meet her when she returned to New York. He said, quote, I met her last Friday morning. We sat on the ship and talked 2 hours. She talked wildly and incoherently. She told me that the cause of her long suffering was a man who, many years before, had wronged her. She did not name him then. She was thin and drawn, not like her old self at all. I took her to the hotel and then to lunch. She asked me to call at the hotel again Saturday afternoon, and I did so. We went to lunch and she again talked wildly. This time she told me that Dr. Glickstein had wronged her, but she did not say that she intended to seek vengeance or that she had a revolver. I tried to persuade her to go home. She said that maybe she would go home that night and promised to call me up. At 6:30 o'clock, she telephoned me, but I could not understand what she was trying to say. A few minutes later, she called again and said, quote, I have shot him, end quote. Then she hung up. I went to Brooklyn to make inquiries about her, but it was after 11 o'clock when I got hold of her father and related what she told me. I did not go with her to Brooklyn and have not seen her since Saturday afternoon, end quote. During her talk with D.A. Lewis, quote, I felt that the man, Glickstein, possessed my very mind and soul, and I had an idea that if I got a revolver, it would help me to drive those thoughts out of my brain. That's why I got it, end quote. Charles is giving more of his side, and you can tell we're mental health issues and talking about them publicly. We're just not a part of the general lexicon back then. Quote, we could never talk of what it was that was troubling her all the time. The Christian Science practitioner told her to tell me that she must not discuss it with anyone. The psychoanalyst to whom she went told me that I should never discuss it with her. We never could talk about it. I tried to take everybody's advice. I was trying to help her all I could, end quote. It's sad. In the present, we're all about talking about your feelings and sharing and whatnot. Back then, they were like, keep it to yourself. You'll do more harm than good. But what I have read about Charles, he does seem like a genuinely good guy. While she was in Florida, he had wired her to stay in Jacksonville to wait for his sister to arrive there, and that he would come down at Christmas to bring her back home. By the time the wire would have been received, she was already on the boat heading back to New York. When asked about his last correspondence with her before the murder, he said, quote, the last letter I had from her was last Thursday. She was then in New York, but I didn't know it. Saturday night, I was in Jamaica, New York, where we have a retail store. Remember, he's a toy manufacturer. I had a call from my father-in-law, Mr. Schaefer, her father, telling me to call on Lillian at the Hotel Breslin. I met her there, and she told me what she had done. I couldn't believe it was true. We drove around for 3 or 4 hours, not knowing what to do. Then I took her home, and I tried to get in touch with Mr. Levy, my lawyer. I tried all that evening and the next day, Sunday, but I didn't get him until Monday, and then he took charge of matters for us, end quote. He concluded, quote, I will fight for her to the last, end quote. December 19th. Lillian, who this particular paper is calling the former love slave of Dr. Glickstein, said that all his widow has to do is ask for her to die and she will take her own life, which, good Lord, what a horrible thing to ask of anyone. She's willing to give her life in payment for the one she took, even as she finally feels free from Dr. Glickstein's pull. So, not much is happening for a few months, and as we seem to always state in these cases, that there isn't just the one victim. First, Dr. Glickstein, of course. Then Dr. Glickstein's mother literally dying next to his casket. Then, finally, Dr. Glickstein's widow, Anna, in April 1922, would be found in front of her home dead of apparent suicide from a 3-story jump. Apparently, she said prior to this, quote, any woman can commit murder now, especially a woman like Mrs. Raizen. She will be freed too. All she will have to do is say she was insane, end quote. Now remember, Olivia Stone was acquitted in her trial because of temporary insanity. Mrs. Glickstein is basically figuring that it will be the same case here, even though we're not at that point yet in Lillian's trial. Additionally, maybe this is just me assuming stuff, but after Dr. Glickstein had died, she and a daughter had gone to open his 2 safety deposit boxes, where he alleged to have had some $50,000 in gold stored there. And what they found in one was nothing. The other contained a rubber band. So his widow would have had little money to live on, perhaps. Again, that was never brought up as a reason, but I could see that weighing heavily on her too. April 27th, 1922. Trial for Lillian, well, sort of. The alienists are doing a looky-look into her psyche. We're following closely on the heels of Olivia's own trial. In fact, apparently the two would discuss the goings-on of Olivia's trial in the evenings inside the jail. May 13th, 1922. Lillian's recounting her present feelings and some past memories. She's not looking into the future. Quote, "What's the use? All the song and joy of life are gone. It has been that way ever since a warm afternoon some 9 years ago. I had been working very hard. My head was aching. My employer told me to take the afternoon off and go to a doctor. I went. It was 3 o'clock. He wasn't in, so I decided to wait. The only pleasure I had in life besides work was my music. I took singing and piano lessons and was getting rather advanced in harmonics and composition. While waiting for the physician, I noticed a piano in the corner. Since there was no one else in the waiting room, I began to play softly. I soon forgot my headache. I forgot that I was in a physician's waiting room. I don't know how long I played. I was in the middle of a new piece, a beautiful French love song. The love of my heart must have been bursting forth into song when I heard a noise. It was he. Quote, 'Don't stop, I like it.' End quote. I was flustered. I was always bashful. I tried to sing, but I couldn't. He coaxed me to keep on. He sat down beside me. There was a peculiar glitter in his eye. He drew closer. And then, end quote. She closes her eyes and then continues, quote, 'It was the beginning. That little French love song started all this trouble.' End quote. She kept seeing the doctor, breaking things off with Charles. She stopped her piano lessons. She stopped singing. She ended things with the doctor and went back to Charles. May 16th, 1922. Well, there goes the insanity plea. Doctors examining her gave their report to Judge Martin and said that she was sane, which contradicts the alienists the defense had hired. The ones giving the report to Judge Martin are alienists appointed by Judge Martin. The report from Dr. John Meager or Dr. Frank Sr. or both, quote, "The accused Lillian S. Raizen is not, nor has been, insane, either by the standard of law or that of medicine. That she is of the deliberate, immoral type is a fact. That she is of neurotic type, like hundreds of thousands of our citizens, is true. She attempted, not very successfully, to simulate insanity. Likewise, her desire to dissimulate was marked when we delved into such questions as anger, hatred, and why she maintained her relations with her victim for so many years. We conclude as follows. Did she will this act? She did. Did she intend harm by the shooting? She did. Did she do it to satisfy herself for her own gratification? She did. It was an act of retaliation. Did she know and appreciate the circumstance in which the murder was done? She did, fully. She had premeditated the act for a long time. She had made careful preparations, and after committing the murder, she made good her escape. The murder was premeditated and deliberately carried out. It was the result of hate and not the result of insanity." End quote. It's October 1922. Still no trial. The alienists, including the defenses, aren't agreeing on her sanity or insanity. Witnesses before the special commission regarding her sanity are testifying about how she had told this person she was going to New York to kill the doctor. Another recounted a conversation that Lillian had about Dr. Glickstein's hold over Lillian. Another woman said that Lillian had showed her the gun and explained that she was going to kill the doctor with it. Mid-November 1922. Lillian's dropping the insanity plea. However, it sounds like by December, when it's confirmed she's going to trial, was that temporary insanity still could be brought in. Court. January 1923. We're going to trial. She doesn't seem to care if she gets death or not. Her husband is still steadfast by her. Quote, "That's all that matters. His faith in me is all I care for. Through all of this terrible tragedy, as only one man in millions would have done. If his confidence would waver, even for an instant, I would give up all hope and lose interest in everything. Never a word of reproach. Never a word of disappointment. Always encouragement." End quote. February 1923. Trial is wearing on Lillian's already fragile nerves. Apparently, she's had a few outbursts during her husband's and father's testimonies. Others have testified that she's been acting odd for several months before the shooting, that she had talked about or possibly attempted to take her own life. Albert Bradley, her friend that worked at a restaurant, testified that he knew her before she married Charles, before she had met Dr. Glickstein when she would come to the lunchroom. He had given her a newspaper to read. They talked and started hanging about together as friends, having meals together socially, and would talk about books, music, news. She married May 1921. Albert didn't see her between March 1921 and December 1921, but on the morning of December 10th, 1921, she asked him to visit her at the Hotel Breslin and confessed. "A man whose name I cannot divulge has wronged me," she told him. That same night, said Bradley, she called him at the lunchroom he worked at and said, "Albert, I've done it." "What?" he asked. "I've shot him." Bradley said she screamed and hung up the receiver. 20 minutes later, she called again and said, "I've shot and killed Dr. Abraham Glickstein at 535 Bedford Avenue, and I'm trying to get my father. Goodbye." End quote. When asked if Albert and Lillian had anything going on, he said no. Quote, "I never intended to marry that woman. There were 3 specific reasons: the vast difference in our ages, my poverty, and the differences in our religious beliefs." End quote. Quote, "Did she think a lot of you?" End quote. Quote, "I do not know." End quote. Quote, "Did you think a lot of her?" End quote. Quote, "I respected her. I respect her now." End quote. When Lillian's dad took the stand, she cried out, quote, "Oh, Papa, dear Papa, please forgive me for all the sorrow I have brought into your life." End quote. February 17th, 1923. The case is in the jury's hands at 11 p.m. February 19th. So, what do you think happened? The verdict. If you think the coincidences and similarities between her and Olivia continue here, well, they don't. She's been found guilty, except not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder, which carries a sentence usually of about 20 years. She will be sent to Auburn Prison. When she received her sentencing, her husband whispered, quote, "Be brave, dearest. Be brave, dearest." End quote. We may do a story about this later, but once again it's been brought up about how juries can have a hard time convicting women. I've seen several stories about this during my research for this and past cases. Remember, there were no women on juries at this point. It would be a few more years. So we've got all male juries saying that women who may resemble their ma, their wife, their sis, their whatever, are potentially going to their death. Joseph Gallagher, prosecutor in the Raizen case, said, quote, "The trouble with most murder cases in which a woman is the defendant has been that the dead man was held up for trial instead of the woman. If it could be shown that the dead man was a rotter and deserved to be killed anyway, the woman was acquitted and she walked out of the courtroom in the midst of a cheering crowd. But that day is rapidly passing. Partly it's the flapper's fault. By her exaggerated conduct, she has gradually shaken man from the notion that woman was entitled to some special deference. Partly the growth of suffrage is responsible. Along with equal rights, women have learned that they must accept equal responsibilities and that the law can no longer be expected to make sex discriminations." End quote. If you're wondering how Olivia fared after her trial acquittal and her attempted suicide, as of March 1922, thanks to a reporter who was interviewing her about how things were going, they weren't good at the time, he called up one Arthur Nash who ran a clothing factory, and she becomes a visiting nurse at the Golden Rule clothing factory. A newspaper would point out that at least on the surface, Lillian may have the better deal of the two. Lillian has a place to sleep, has regular meals, has opportunities to develop herself in vocations and hobbies like art and music and books. She could use her smarts to help others in the prison. She could make herself a part of the community she finds herself in now. Olivia, as you remember, couldn't find work for some time, was probably shunned by many in consideration that though she was acquitted, she did still kill someone. Interesting when you think about it. Of course, that's only on the surface. Lillian is still locked up for at least 20 years. Olivia is free. So I want to thank you to the new subscribers who have joined my channel in the recent weeks. I appreciate you. And thank you to those who have continued sticking with me here through thick and thick. I'm not sure what story I'm doing next week yet, though primarily I do true crime. Sometimes I need a palate cleansing story, but we'll see. Until then, see you.